This is Bruce Winston. I'm with the School of Global Leadership and Entrepreneurship here at Regent University. The paper that I am reading today is entitled Pride's Form of Joy, Esteem, Confidence, Haughtiness, and Hubris, a conceptual discussion for leaders' self-evaluation. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling, according to Proverbs 16:18. This proverb should be troubling for leaders today in that few would want to be destroyed or stumble. But what is it about pride that seems to be so destructive? Not all writers agree on the meaning of pride or that pride is bad. In fact, even the Old Testament writers use pride to mean both good and bad, as evidenced in the meaning of the Hebrew gaon that we translate as pride from the proverb I just read. This can mean exaltation, majesty in a good sense, but also arrogance in the bad sense. Even the Hebrew gobah, that is translated as haughty in the proverb above, can be used for exaltation on the good side and haughtiness on the bad side. Proverbs 18:12 says, "Before destruction the heart of man is haughty, and before honor is humility." This helps a little in that the first part of the proverb ties together the terms destruction and haughty. Of interest, gabah shows a positive use of humility. Later in this paper, I'll talk about the relationship of pride to humility. Also of interest here to me is that gobah from the Proverbs 16:18 is the noun form of haughty, and gabah from Proverbs 18:12 is the verb form. It's interesting to note that the Hebrew use of pride includes both good and bad, but the New Testament Greek seems to treat pride all bad. Examples include the use of the Greek hubrephaneia in Mark 17:22, from where we get the English term hubris, and tufu from 1 Timothy 3:6 that infers to be puffed up with haughtiness or pride. However, boasting in others or boasting in God seems to be an acceptable practice, according to 2 Corinthians 9:2 as well as 2 Thessalonians 1:4. The literature on pride seems to be divided between pride being good in that it relates to positive self-esteem and confidence, according to Tillich and Burns, or it can be bad in that it takes the form of haughtiness or hubris, according to Lamoth, Schimmel, Augustine, McIntosh and Rima, Brown, Howard, and Reno. Or that pride is both according to Torres, Chang, Tracy, and Henrik, Braithwaite, Ahmed and Braithwaite, and Chang. The purpose of this conceptual paper today is threefold: to define pride from the literature, to show a continuum of humility as a virtue to pride as vice, and to show how leaders might conduct a self-evaluation regarding pride in themselves. Viewers of this reading today may be able to better create leadership development and evaluation programs within their own organizations as a result of this presentation. The next section, Pride Defined from the Literature. Patterson described 4 types of pride based on Niebuhr's work. First is pride of power. Next, intellectual pride as a sublimation of power. Next, moral pride based on intellectual pride. And last, spiritual pride as an outcome of moral pride. Thus, according to Patterson's interpretation of Niebuhr, pride progresses from a base of power to mental, to moral, to spiritual, each becoming more entrenched in the individual. At the end of this 4-phase process, the person sees him or herself as equal to God. Torres indicates that the 7 deadly sins and their corresponding virtues can be found in various forms in most all major world religions, thus creating a universal understanding of moral obligations, or in other words, a base for a code of conduct. The literature seems to classify pride into 6 categories: joy, esteem, confidence, haughtiness, hubris, and narcissism. The first section of joy. 2 Corinthians 9:2 uses a term, kauchemia, that we translate as boast, where Paul indicated that he wanted to be prideful of what others have done. In 2 Corinthians 10:8, Paul implied that he wanted to boast of what God had done in his life. Paul boasted about others as well in 2 Thessalonians 1:4. Perhaps boasting about others is appropriate, but perhaps boasting about self is not. What then do we do when others boast about us? Paul wrote that love does not brag in 1 Corinthians 13:4. It seems that exulting and boasting about the work of others is okay, but not boasting about one's own work. This seems perhaps to tie then to the Romans 12 gift of encouraging, in which encourages another. Conger and Benjamin make the claim that charismatic leaders create a sense of pride in followers toward the leader. Thus, pride is a sense of joy in someone else. Katzenbach claims that people's pride in their work is a greater motivator than money. This ties well with Deming's admonition that a role of leadership is to help people find joy in their work. Katzenbach also, as well as McIntosh, built on this by seeing pride as a strategic asset for the leader. Section on esteem. Torres bifurcated pride as either a sense of one's own value and dignity or an excessively high opinion of one's self. Hence, we see both good and bad in pride. Chen defined pride as the only emotion in which people feel good about themselves. Chen contends that it's pride that motivates people to increase performance and perseverance. Chen goes on to acknowledge the two forms of pride, hubris and authentic. These two were developed first by Tracy and Robbins and later used in the work by Cheng, Tracy, and Hendricks, as well as Tracy, Sharaf, and Cheng. Goleman equates pride with self-acceptance and seeing yourself in a positive light. Ziegler-Hill differentiates high self-esteem as either secure, which is a healthy condition, or fragile, which is a condition leading to narcissism. Section on confidence. Tillich argued that pride was good, being part of the self, but that hubris was undesirable, in that hubris was the intentional comparison of self as divine. Burns stated that pride is the reliance on oneself. Cheng, Tracy, and Henrich distinguished two forms of pride: hubristic, implying a focus on dominance, and authentic, representing prestige. Chen, Tracy, and Henrich contend that individuals can choose which of these two forms of pride one wishes as a means to an end. This freedom of choice becomes a key element for self-evaluation and self-development. Their argument extends to imply that one can gain by hubris through the use of fear and intimidation, or through authentic pride that contributes to a positive self-esteem and hard work. While confidence is good, it can move to haughtiness, as Paul warned in Romans 12:3. For through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think so as to have sound judgment, as God has allotted to each a measure of faith. This verse speaks to the balanced view of self, perhaps a base for self-efficacy through self-control. Section on haughtiness. James 4:16 provided us with a negative point of boasting, yet in first 9 of James said that the lowly man will be exalted. Thus we have a contrast of boasting of self with the boasting about others. Torres applies to this section in that Torres defined one side of pride as having an excessively high opinion of oneself. Lamoth also defined pride as someone thinking too highly of him or herself. 2 Corinthians 12:20 shows Paul's concern that he and the church may not see each other as each wishes to see, and the result includes a list of things including phusios, or a puffing up of the soul. This phusios is haughtiness, in that the result is a deliberate effort by someone to think more highly than he should. This can be a reaction to others' view not being as good as the person desires.